in this video, I'm going to show you how you can sew your own dirndl, and it's actually not that complicated. Even though it's not very difficult, I do recommend that you have some experience sewing and some experience using a sewing machine, because that will make this a lot easier. And if you know my channel, my name is Anja. I love sharing a lot of DIYs, and as a homage to my heritage, which is German, I love making dirndls. Now, if you really like this dirndl and you'd like to have it, I have decided I am gonna sell it, and I will leave a link in the description box below this video. If the link is still there, then this dirndl is still available. If the link is no longer there, then somebody has already purchased it. Now, here's a few things before we start making this dirndl. And actually, I am adding chapter marks to this entire video, so you can skip forward and back. And if you're sewing along with me and you need to repeat a certain step, you can always rewind back and then find the chapter that you're looking for. The first question may be, where do you find a pattern? This is loosely based. I've taken some liberties on this Burda 8448 pattern. Again, there's a link in the description box below this video where you can easily find it here in the US. I also have a book. I'm leaving the link for you too, which is in German. However, I know that many of you speak German or are in Germany, and you can find a lot of really easy dirndl sewing patterns in this book, because they actually have the entire patterns here in the back of the book. From my own experience, I can tell you that you can get the best dirndl fabrics in Germany and probably Austria and Switzerland, even though I haven't looked there. But I have found these fabrics here in the US, and you can go to Joann's, which is what I like, because then I can really see the colors. However, I have to say that there are some really nice fabrics on Amazon that you can get. There is a German store that I am aware of that will actually ship traditional dirndl fabrics to the US, and again, you will find all the links below this video. For this dirndl, I have chosen this fabric combination, which is a very classic combination, and you can't see this one because it is my lining. And that brings me to the next point: which kind of fabrics are the best for dirndls? I recommend a stiffer fabric, like a cotton is always a good one. You can also use linen blends. You can use a satin or a silk. I do not recommend using anything stretchy like jersey, because it just won't keep the shape and the bodice is fitted, and that just won't work so well. Again, for the lining, and I do recommend you line your dirndl, I chose a very thin cotton, because with the traditional dirndl blouses that only go to here, you will have a lot of bare skin against the inside of your dirndl. And I think that cotton just feels so much better than something from polyester. And if somewhat through the video you're deciding, oh my gosh, that is way more than I am ready for, I'm also leaving a link to my friend Erica's dirndl store here in the US. It's called Rare Dirndl. She not only designs all her dirndls here actually in Chicago, but she also sews them here in the US, and she has a lot of really cool styles. I highly recommend that you check her out. First, I like to wash my fabrics on the highest temperature that is appropriate for that fabric, and then I like to iron it so that it lies nice and flat. Then I like to pin my cutout pattern pieces to my fabric, but you want to always follow the instructions as to how to arrange them on your fabric and which pieces to cut out. Then I cut my pieces out of the fabric. Here's the piece for the apron and for the skirt. Next, I cut out the pieces for the interfacing that I iron on with a wet cloth. For the piping, I cut off long strips of fabric that are about 3.5 centimeters wide, which is about 1.38 inches wide. Or you can use bias tape for that as well. For making the piping, I use my zipper foot and place the piping cord to the outside of my fabric strips, and then I sew really close to the piping cord between the strip of fabric. Then I lay the piping on the seam between the two back pieces and attach it, and there's just about the 1.5 centimeters seam allowance, and I like to pin it into place. And still with my zipper foot, I sew it to the back piece just right where the previous thread was. I'm attaching the smaller back piece to the bigger back piece, and I start with the long side here, adding the seam allowance, and then it often helps to attach it on both ends and then slowly work your way in so that you distribute it evenly. And it is a curve, so you want to go slow. And here I'm working it to see how it fits together. Now I sew those two pieces together. Actually, I'm going pretty slow and make sure that I sew as close to the piping as possible. Here you can see what that looks like, and then I'll repeat that for the other side. Since there is quite a bit of fabric on the inside, I like to cut out these little triangles, especially in the curved areas, so that there isn't so much thickness under those seams. Moving on to the front, I sew two pieces together, except I'm not using piping here, but it's just like for the two back pieces, first pinning and then sewing. Now I attach the front to the back piece and close the shoulder seam, and I may have actually sewn the wrong pieces together, which I corrected later, but once you have the right pieces, you want to iron the hem there to make it nice and flat. Now I'm attaching the piping to the neckline and the back, and I'm just attaching it like I did before. And remember to do this for both sides, so you always do everything times 2. And I sew that into place. Now I'm sewing all the 4 pieces of lining together, just like the front pieces, except for that the lining doesn't have any piping. In the next step, I am placing the lining pieces right on top of the front pieces, right sides to right sides, and pin them into place so I can sew the whole neckline. Here you can see how I'm sewing those pieces together following my previous seam. In order to prevent the seams from bulking up underneath, I cut these little slits, especially in the curved areas. Before I continue, I like to hot iron the pieces into place so that they lie nice and flat. Once I've done that, I like to pin the lining into place so it stays where it's supposed to be. For the next step, I'm attaching the piping to the armholes all the way around. And sew those in place following my previous seam. And again, to keep the seam from bulking up under the armholes, I cut little slits into it. Next, I iron the piping seam to the inside of the pieces. And here I'm cutting these short slits into the curved pieces of the lining before I attach that into place. This next step is a little bit slow and tedious, but I'm folding the lining to the inside and pin it into place. And sometimes I have to go over some areas twice just to make sure that I get really close to the piping and making sure that the lining doesn't bulk up or create creases. So this is a little bit slow going. And once I have pinned the lining into place, I sew right along that seam between the piping and the fabric and go really slow, which will sew the lining to the front pieces. Now I'm pinning the pieces together on the sides and clean them up using a zigzag stitch. And this step, I'm attaching the two front and back pieces by the sides and create a long seam down the side. And using the hot iron, I like to press the hems. For the skirt, you can see I've already done one side and I'm going to do the other side using my pattern to mark where the pleats are. I have 7 where the back is and 3 where the front is. To create the pleats, I take the long stretches and line up those little lines. That's where the folded part is, and the shorter distance is the distance between 2 pleats. And I'm going to slow it down so you can see it again. And now I sew those pleats into place with just one single seam. If you're following the Burda 8448 pattern very closely, you might realize that I only have 2 skirt panels, which I will sew together on the sides, leaving a little bit more than 6 inches in the back where I'm not sewing, and I mark that so I know where that place is. However, I am attaching the left and right panels together and pin them so that I can sew them. And here I'm sewing them together. And again, I am pressing the hemline so it lies nice and flat. To finish off the skirt, I have folded the bottom of the skirt twice, and I will sew the hemline together. So now I'm adding a zigzag stitch to the back pieces. In this next step, I'm pinning the zipper to the 2 back pieces. Again, here I'm veering from the original Burda pattern because I will be closing the front of the dirndl, and I had measured and marked where I wanted those 2 pieces to overlap. So that's where they are, where the pins are. I turn the bodice inside out and I will sew the 2 pieces together on the inside of where they fold. In the next step, I am sewing the top of the front together so that there is no gaping, and I will sew it right in that gap between the piping and the fabric. In this step, I am adding a zigzag stitch to the bottom of the bodice. Here I have my bodice, and I will place the skirt inside out, so right sides together, over the bodice just like that. And I'm making sure to line up the front middle of the bodice to the front middle of the skirt. Here I have skinned the bodice to the skirt, or the skirt to the bodice. And just a pro tip, if it's too long, you can always add a pleat somewhere to make the skirt fit the bodice. Now I will sew the zipper to the bodice. I've also attached the zipper to the skirt and pinned it, so I will sew that into place on one side. And on the other side, and sometimes you have to move the zipper foot up and down a little bit to make sure that you can sew around it. For the apron, I'm using again my pleat markings from the skirt, and I'm using 4 on each side. I use the same process for creating the pleats as for the skirt. In this step, I sew the pleats of the skirt and finish the top of the skirt with a simple zigzag stitch. I fold the sides of the skirt twice and hem it. For the ribbon, I sew the 2 pieces together in the middle. I folded and pressed the ribbon in half, the long side, and now I'm gonna sew the piece together, just a very narrow seam there, very narrow hem. To turn the ribbon outside in, I attach a safety pin. I could have used a bigger one, but that's all I had, and simply press it and move it all the way through the inside of it, and I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. Here it is, and now I need to just pull it all the way through, and then the inside will come out. I have pressed the ribbon with a hot iron and with the seam in the middle, and now I like to cut off the ends diagonally, and I fold the outside in there, and then I'm gonna sew that into place. It's a little bit tricky sometimes to get it all right, but I make it work. Now I am attaching the ribbon to the front of the skirt with the seam on the back, and first I pin it and then I sew it into place. To finish the skirt, I have folded the bottom of the skirt twice and sew the hemline. And to sew on the buttons, I am using my pattern here with the markings for the buttons, and mark that on my bodice, and then I will simply sew the buttons on very tight because they're blind buttons, meaning that they don't actually open and close the front, they're just there for decorative purposes. And again, if you've made it this far and you've decided, oh, that is a lot of work, it is a lot of work. It takes a little bit of time to sew a dirndl. I also have a really nice kitchen crossback apron pattern that you can find right here, which is perfect practice for something like a dirndl. I hope that you really enjoyed watching this video and sewing along with me, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.